Well, this is something that we predicted or we thought might happen. Another mistrial for Quentin Tellis in the Jessica Chambers murder. I want to talk right now with our very special guest, Vincent Hill, who's our own host here on the Law and Crime Network and also a law enforcement expert. Vincent, good morning to you.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So are you surprised by this? I know there were rumblings. We heard a little bit by the jury that they were being deadlocked, but we've seen juries come back with a verdict after being deadlocked. Are you surprised this is the ultimate conclusion in the second trial of Quentin Tellis?
You know, Jesse, actually, I'm not surprised. I mean, I think the prosecution had a huge hurdle to get over, especially as it relates. We've heard this time and time again during this trial, this whole Eric thing. They brought on this speech pathologist that said it's impossible, but yet you had several people come back and say, well, this is what I heard. So I think the prosecution had a huge hurdle in getting over that. And not only that, I mean, let's be clear here. There was this talk about the burns on Quentin's arms that I don't think the prosecution actually pressed. I think I would have just ingrained that in the jury's head, like, hey, listen, this guy had burns right around the same time Jessica Chambers was burnt alive, but they really didn't press that. So I think the prosecution had huge hurdles to overcome that they just couldn't.
Yeah, and he said he got those burns from jumping over a bonfire at a nearby local hangout. You know, Vincent, this was a 6-6 split. You can't get more split down the middle than that. I mean, is this just one of those cases where it's impossible to secure a guilty verdict or impossible to secure an acquittal? It's just one of those cases that's impossible to take to a jury.
Right. I think it is, Jesse. I mean, listen, we had, a predominantly black jury here, but it was 6-6 down the middle. So they were split there. I think it's just based on the evidence here. And there's a lot of key evidence that is not coming up in this trial here. And also, especially when you look at the fact that the keys, I think the defense did a great job of, just kind of discrediting that whole, well, the keys were found here and they were taken to a 124 Main Street. We took a picture of where he said the keys were found, the exclusion of Quentin on those keys. There was just so much that the state was up against to try to secure a conviction here.
Yeah, it's not an easy case, and what we know, the prosecution says it will not retry Tellis until Louisiana authorities try him on murder charges in that state. As you know, he does face murder charges, a separate case, so we'll have to see what ultimately happens to Mr. Tellis. Vincent, stand by. As we wait for the live feed and Jason Van Dyke, we want to analyze maybe how this Chambers verdict came to be. So let's begin with the defense's opening statement, and you can get an understanding of where their argument ultimately laid, and then we'll talk more about the prosecution. But here's the defense's opening statement. Okay, so that's the opening statements from both the prosecution and the defense. We're starting from the beginning and trying to analyze how we ended up with another mistrial in the Jessica Chambers case. Back here with Vincent Hill. Vincent, if there was never any discussion about Eric or Derek, if there was never any of these first responders coming forward, do you think the prosecution could have secured a guilty verdict?
Absolutely. No doubt in my mind. And here's why. Simply because the cell phone data, right? The data doesn't lie. Witnesses lie. Eyewitnesses' testimony can be misconstrued, but the data doesn't lie, right? So when you see that Jessica and Quentin were in the same location, their cell phones were pinging off the same tower, the data tells you that Quentin Tellis was the last person to be known to be around Jessica Chambers. And that time frame of when his phone became active again leaves little time for someone else to have come in and done this to Jessica Chambers.
And the suspicious behavior, him changing his stories, him writing that weird text message, hey, I can't see you tonight, even though he had just seen her.
He had just seen her, exactly.
So if the prosecution, I hate playing Monday morning quarterback, they brought in a speech pathologist to say, hey, maybe she probably couldn't say Eric or Derek like everyone's saying. What else did they need to do?
Yeah, I don't know if I would have called him the speech pathologist. I mean, especially when you have so many people saying they know exactly what they heard. I think they should have focused more on the timeline, maybe even just do the drive. One of the things, we heard from this supposed witness that picked up a black male on that night, right? So one of the things, okay, how would Quentin have got from where Jessica was burnt back to his place to get his sister's vehicle? if it wasn't him inside that car. The prosecution never established that it was him inside that car. So I would have went out and done the timeline. How long would it have taken him to run this mile or so, get to his sister's car and do things like that?
And that's maybe what they're considering if they want to retry him. Again, they're not going to retry him until they figure out what the conclusion is of those state charges in Louisiana where he faces separate murder charges. So we're on hold right now, and we'll talk about what the fate of this case may ultimately be. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Okay, so that's the testimony in the Jessica Chambers case of one of the first responders who heard what he sounded like an Eric or Derek when asking Jessica Chambers, who did this to you. Back here with Vincent Hill. Vincent, do we have to accept the scary proposition that after this second mistrial, we may never get an answer as to who did this, as to who burnt Jessica Chambers alive?
You know, Jesse, unfortunately, I think we may have to come to that conclusion. So here's what's important here. Not only did that first responder say she said Eric or Derek, but she was quite clear he made out her name, Jessica Chambers. So back to the speech pathologist, she said there's just no way she would be able to articulate any words where people would understand. But not only did he hear Eric or Derek, he heard Jessica Chambers. So it begs the question, you know, do we go with this Eric theory or do we go with the speech pathologist? Like, who do you go with?
Yeah, and let's not also forget she was able to say certain other words like cold and thirsty. So, I mean, and Eric or Derek is a far cry away from Quentin or Tellis. It's difficult. Now, again, we're still, where you and I were guessing what the state she was in and what she was able to say or not. I mean, it's impossible. But it's a scary idea to think that we may never know who did this. I mean, what do you tell the family of Jessica Chambers? There's just never going to be an answer? There's never going to be a conclusion for them?
Yeah, and that's the hard part. Listen, as a dad of a 22-year-old daughter, you know, my heart definitely goes out to the Chambers family. But what does the state tell that family? Like, hey, we can never bring justice for your daughter, justice for your family. That's a hard conversation to have if I was the prosecutor.
It's impossible. It's a really impossible situation. It's funny that you mentioned the speech pathologist, because that's what I want to talk right now about. I want to play some of the testimony of this witness, Dr. Carolyn Higdon, and this is the person who was brought by the state, an expert, somebody that they didn't bring in the first trial of Quentin Tellis, to talk about whether or not Jessica Chambers had the ability to mouth and say words in that condition. Let's see what she had to say. All right, Vincent, so here's an expert who came on the stand. Her specialty is all of this. What can people say in this condition? She says she wouldn't be able to mouth words. Now, the counter-argument to that is she wasn't at the crime scene. So, again, what is the jury thinking there? Is that why we had a 6-6 split?
Yeah, it could be. Listen, the human body is an amazing thing. Sometimes even when science says the body can't do something, it does. And keep in mind, these first responders, they don't have a dog in the fight. They didn't know Quentin. They didn't know a guy named Eric. They didn't even know Jessica. So there's no reason that they would just come out, not just one, but several, and say, hey, we heard what we heard. They didn't have a reason to say that. They were just there doing their jobs, and they took her statement.
And the prosecution says, well, they heard one person say that, so then they thought that they heard that, and they kind of corroborated their stories with one another. Do you take any value to that argument?
No, because, again, they don't have a dog in the fight. So why would one first responder say, oh, I heard Eric, and then everyone else is going to follow suit? And then, you know, there was another witness who was not a first responder who said she even heard her say Eric or Derek. She said she had to get really close, but she heard it. Yeah,
because we don't have any idea that these first responders were like, oh, I know an Eric or Derek who might have done this. It's not like they knew that. I mean, they're just relaying the information from the victim at that point, which is a rare thing to have in these kinds of cases. We're going to take a quick break. Again, we're carefully monitoring for Jason Van Dyke, but when we come back, we'll talk more about Jessica Chambers. Stay tuned. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the timeline of these events and the relationship between Tellis and Chambers. Back with Vincent Hill. Vincent, this means that if we believe somebody else committed this crime, that they would have needed to do this after Tellis left Jessica, and there was an hour time frame when they could have snuck in, killed her, and ran away. Is that what I'm understanding here? There's a missing hour of time, and it wouldn't have been him.
That's right. But the bigger question is who would have had the motive to sneak in and do this within that 1 hour time frame? But I think what the jury was struggling with, you heard that FBI agent say that Jessica went to the emergency room and Quentin went with her. So the defense was establishing this relationship like, hey, he was a loving, caring guy. He's going to the emergency room with her. Why would he do this? So that's the biggest issue that I think the jury had to deal with was, all right, if there was someone else who did it, what would be the motive? And then B, this guy's going to the emergency room with her. It really, I don't think it could be him. Look what he did. Who does that?
So, look, we can't handle a lot of cases here, and I'm sure in your career you've seen 1,000 different kinds of incidents and 1,000 different kinds of crimes. You know, motive isn't an element of the prosecution's case, but it does help tell the story. Can't you have say, hey, listen, people kill people for a variety of different reasons. You don't know what goes in their head. Maybe she said the wrong thing to him at the wrong time, and if she kept saying no to him for sex, couldn't someone just snap?
Yeah, absolutely, but I don't think the state actually tried to relay that whole snapping piece of this, right? They were just more focused on, well, he said this, and then, you know, the interview revealed this. I don't think they relayed that in because a lot of jurors assume that, oh, you need a motive to kill someone. What was the motive? A lot of jurors, they watch, you know, Law and Order, SVU, and the motive was this. The unsub did this. So a lot of jurors, they're still wanting that motive. And unless you drive other facts home, you could get a hung jury.
Yeah, because I guess at the end of the day, it's a weak motive, so let's not even bring it up. I mean, why did he kill her? I don't know. I guess that's what it is, and they maybe felt that it wasn't that strong and that wasn't the way to go. When we get back, we have to take a quick break. We're going to talk more about Jessica Chambers and talk more about the investigation itself, which the defense criticized. We'll be right back. The words and actions and behaviors of Quentin Tellis coming back to haunt him. Back here with Vincent Hill. So the debate was always that, is this a guy who was hanging out with this girl, didn't want to be caught up in this investigation and was just not telling the truth? Or is this a guy who really committed this crime and was trying to cover it up? What do you think?
Well, see, here's the problem, Jesse. I mean, that interview was almost a year to the date after Jessica's death, right? So was Quentin actually lying, or was it something he forgot? I would argue that he was lying. I mean, anytime there's something that traumatic, you remember it. I've written 2 books, Playbook to a Murder and Incomplete Past, about the death of Steve McNair, Titans quarterback. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I can tell you exactly what I was doing when I heard the news, what I was wearing. My son can even tell you what was going on. But Quentin seemed to say, oh, it was this, or oh, it was that. So I think he was lying and being deceptive in the fact that he was trying to cover up his involvement in Jessica's murder. But again, it was up to the jury.
You know, a lot of people, when we watch these cases, either assume that they assume that defendants are maybe a lot more sophisticated than they believe, in the sense that, hey, I'm going to send this text, hey, I'm going to say this alibi, I'm going to say this, because that's part of the bigger scheme of hiding evidence. But maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's something, a more simple solution, or maybe you have a defendant who's just not that sophisticated in committing a crime. I mean, how are we supposed to think about these cases?
Yeah, I don't think he was that sophisticated. I will say I believe that text message that his girlfriend was coming into town was simply an alibi because the two were together. But I think what he did not realize is that even though he was deleting these text messages, that data is stored somewhere and you can still get it. I think he was under the assumption that since he had a throwaway phone, as it's known on the streets, a prepaid phone, that those text messages
Vincent, we'll be right back. We got a lot to talk about. So another mistrial. That's frustrating for every side, both the prosecution and the defense, and also the jurors, as you just heard. Everybody wanted an answer, but unfortunately, they couldn't get to one. I want to bring back in Vincent Hill, law enforcement expert, and also fellow host here on Law and Crime. Vincent, one of the big reasons you have to imagine that they got a mistrial is we talked about the Eric and Derek situation. Now, there's other suspects. We keep hearing testimony from investigators that they investigated not only other Erics or Dereks, but who else Jessica was in contact with. They looked at her social media page, they looked at her phone, they looked at everybody. I'm still confused, though. What does it mean to rule a suspect out? You and I had talked about in the break that Quentin Tellis' sister was dating somebody named Eric Hill. We heard about a Derek Holmes that was allegedly stalking Jessica Chambers. How do you rule these people out?
Well, Jesse, you have to go where the evidence leads you, right? So we heard previous testimony that they did a data dump on Derek Holmes' cell phone. I'm sure they interviewed this Eric Hill, who's actually a key part of Quentin's other murder case in Louisiana, but we definitely don't want to get into that. But you have to go where the evidence leads you, right? So I'm sure investigators were able to establish not only did none of these Erics or Dereks know Jessica, but they were nowhere in the area at the time that her body was set on fire on that fateful day.
But how do we know that? Because Derek Holmes, we heard his mother said he was with her, and then cell phone records. Isn't it possible he could have given his cell phone to someone else?
Oh yeah, that is definitely possible. But I mean, again, you can only rely on the evidence that you have. So if the mother is giving a strong alibi and she knows that it is a felony to lie to police, you have to go on what you assume is the correct evidence. You know, he could have given that cell phone to someone, but his mother says he was here. He says he was there, so you have to go with that.
Sometimes we wish it's like a movie where at the end you do get the answer, you know who the killer is, and that's it. This is real life, though. This is a real story, and it's a tragic story.
Right.
I want to play some of the testimony of Detective Barry Thompson. We played a little bit for you of him before. This is the lead investigator in this case. Let's learn a little bit more about the investigation. All right, what we eventually know is that Quentin Tellis's DNA cannot be excluded from those car keys. Vincent, how much did you value DNA, his DNA maybe being on the car keys? Because the counter argument that is he was hanging out with Jessica Chambers. It's not that surprising.
Exactly, and that's my exact thought, Jesse. I mean, listen, we heard testimony. He was at the hospital with her just days before. Maybe he drove her to the hospital that day because she was sick. They were hanging out. Maybe he drove her car a few times. So the fact that his DNA was on those keys is really not significant in my mind, because this is not a stranger murder, according to the prosecution. This is someone that knew her. So the fact that the DNA would be on those keys is not surprising, and maybe that's what the jury thought as well about that DNA on those keys, Jesse.
One of our viewers wrote us on Twitter that what about the DNA on Jessica Chambers' cell phone? I mean, obviously the car was all burnt up. There was really, it's hard to find anything from there, but the cell phone, I don't know anything specifically about it, and I didn't hear DNA so much on other items. Did you?
No, I didn't. I mean, I'd be curious to find out if there was DNA on her phone. But again, as the defense, I know what their argument would be. Well, they were hanging out. Maybe he was holding her phone. Maybe he was on Facebook from her phone. So again, this is not a stranger murder. If Quentin, came into this investigation as a result of DNA, then definitely we could have that conversation. But yeah, that's not the case here.
Let's move on to Officer Tyler Mills. He's an investigator from Panola County Sheriff's Department. This is a discussion about how they found these keys, and you'll hear the defense really grill him under cross-examination. Let's talk about the collection of these keys, because I'm not an investigator, but I see that something's wrong here. It should be noted that this witness is a part of the Sheriff's Department's narcotics team, and he's never collected evidence in a homicide. Vincent, okay, so first he takes the word of the person who found the keys, then he goes back to the crime scene and just drops them and takes a picture. Oh, that looks like kind of where I found them. What's going on?
Oh, my God, Jesse. I mean, listen. First of all, I can understand why the defense said, why didn't you take a picture of where you first saw the keys on the top of that car? And then you go back to this ditch where you assume this is the exact location you found them. We don't know. You're out in the woods. You're trying to find this ditch. You drop the keys there. You take a picture. There's so much cross-contamination going on with these keys from a DNA standpoint. And let's not forget, Quentin gave his DNA willingly based on verbal consent. So, I mean, this is a huge mistake by the investigators here to have a narcotics officer who's never investigated a homicide to touch physical evidence. Oh, my God, Jesse.
But Vincent, isn't it part of the larger conversation? So if the defense could have shown, hey, listen, look how they messed up the keys. What else did they mess up in this investigation, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, it reminds me of a very famous case. We all heard of it, O.J. Simpson. Once they found out one thing was messed up, oh, my God, look what they did. They could have done this. They could have planted this. So, I mean, this is just, oh, my God, it's police investigation 101, Jesse. You don't cross-contaminate. You don't take evidence back to a scene. You just don't do it.
So I wonder, I mean, you can't help but acknowledge something's wrong here. I mean, you want to question the investigation, but now they got 2 mistrials. The state has 2 mistrials. So clearly, if I'm an outside perspective looking in, thinking about this, I'm wondering, something seems like something's wrong here. Something seems like maybe, a piece of evidence was overlooked, or maybe it wasn't investigated as properly as the prosecution says.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's what a lot of people are thinking. Maybe this wasn't investigated the way the prosecution says it was. They didn't follow every lead. They didn't get DNA samples from the right people. There's so much there that I think was missed in this investigation.
We can't help remember what the defense said, that they couldn't find but the investigators couldn't find anybody else. So they go back to their original suspect, Quentin Tellis, and work backwards to have the evidence work for them. We're going to talk more about that after our next break. You're not going to want to miss it, because we're dissecting every point of this case and trying to understand how we ended at a second mistrial. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. Okay, we're just finishing up our discussion about Jessica Chambers. It was this mistrial again for Quentin Tellis. I want to bring back in Vincent Hill. I know we have to sign you off in a little bit, but I have 2 more questions for you. The first one's about the Jessica Chambers case. Where do we go from here? Where do we all go from here? We've been following this case so much. We've spent so many hours on it with 2 trials. So where do we go from here, Vincent?
Yeah, I think what the state of Mississippi is going to do is wait for that trial in Louisiana and then decide based on that if they will retry Quentin Tellis for the murder of Jessica Chambers. Because at the end of the day, listen, I think that case in Louisiana is much stronger. But at the end of the day, Jessica's family needs answers and they need justice.
And if he's found guilty, he could face life in prison in connection with that one. So we'll have to see. I want to switch gears with you and talk one quick question about our new case that we're going to be talking about, the Jason Van Dyke case. We're waiting for the live feed. We heard a bombshell this past week, and I have to ask your opinion on this. We learned from one of the defense's experts that according to this person, recruits are taught about use of force, and one of the ways they're told they can use force, deadly force, is if a suspect is fleeing an arrest or illegal behavior with a knife, with a weapon. So we're not talking about a threat to other individuals or police. We're talking if you're trying to flee with a weapon, exactly like what you're seeing here, they're permitted, they're taught to use deadly force. I mean, that's a big statement.
Yeah, and see, part of that, Jesse, is part of what's known as the fleeing felon rule, right? So if the officer believes that that person, based on their escape, would be a danger to the public or other officers, then they can use deadly force. And I think we're going to hear testimony from someone that says, yes, Laquan McDonald was acting in an aggressive manner. There were people that felt threatened. So if the defense can prove that, then this opens up a whole different can of worms, and this case may go a different way.
Maybe. I mean, the defense has already been putting forward witnesses talking about how afraid they were of Laquan McDonald, and then we heard that explosive testimony. So who knows which way this is going. Vincent, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we loved having your perspective.
Always a pleasure. I'll see you Thursday in New York, Jesse.
See you Thursday in New York. Okay, everybody, let's go switch gears and talk now about use of force. We want to play the testimony of Yuri Patrick. So this is a good examination about what use of force may be. Take a look.